So why don't we do the guest question first? And Elizabeth says, David, herbal community is struggling to address dysautonomia, often assumed to be POTS, which is arguably the most common characteristic of long COVID. Neither conventional nor traditional approaches are helping very much. I have thoughts and scientific breadcrumbs, and yes, dreams, referring back to earlier, that suggests that the newly acknowledged organ, the interstitium, is in some way involved. If this were the case, do you have any immediate thoughts on herbs that may be beneficial? Dysautonomia can be profoundly affected. Can profoundly affect the ability to function, and the current approaches offer little relief. Our community is identifying the problem, but floundering in our desire to respond. You're a phenomenal teacher, DW. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. That's an incredible question. Now, let's see if I can give you a reasonably good answer. So this is complicated. And what I would say is, the dysautonomia is similar to POTS, postural orthostatic hypertension syndrome, but it's not the same thing. And what I can say, maybe the best thing I say is, first off, what you're talking about a lot is people dealing with long COVID. And I have dealt with a lot of people with long COVID. And the good news is that the percentage of people getting long COVID now is probably a third of what it was 2 years ago. So the number of people developing long COVID is decreasing. I would also say, and I know this will be controversial, but studies actually indicate people who get vaccinated have lower levels of long COVID. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that the research is actually pretty clear about that. But of course, COVID has changed and mutated, and it seems to be, for the most part, I mean, there's still people dying, but it seems to be, for many people who don't have a lot of underlying comorbidities or who are not quite elderly, less fatal. So my experience with long COVID is that COVID causes systemic inflammation. And it's not like with a lot of organ conditions, you have inflammation of this or inflammation of that. With COVID, it can be inflammation of anything and everything. And so, it's not one tissue. There is gut inflammation. There is kidney. I'm not saying in every case, but in many cases, there's gut inflammation, neuroinflammation. And the gut inflammation affects the intestinal microbiome very negatively. There is cardiac inflammation, lung inflammation, liver inflammation, musculoskeletal inflammation ad infinitum. So what I have been doing with some success, I've treated some people who have had long COVID for over 2 years. And I'm not saying that they start herbal treatment and they're all better. No. For many of these people, it's a kind of a, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of phenomenon. But some people have responded really well, and it kind of depends on the person and their vital energy and how well they are able to recover and how much damage has been done. So I am using massive amounts, way higher than normal doses, of what we will call anti-inflammatory herbs. Now, understand that the word anti-inflammatory, as it exists within the framework of pharmaceuticals, is different than what we mean by anti-inflammatory when we talk about herbs. Anti-inflammatory medications shut down, for the most part, almost the entire process of inflammation. COX-1, COX-2, a whole range of inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. And because of that, and understand, we need a certain level of inflammation to function. So shutting down inflammation entirely is actually not a great idea. So that's why we see with like medications that had to be pulled off the market, like Vioxx, we see issues with like cardiac damage and things like that, because they're shutting down everything. And then you don't have the upregulation by a certain level of reactive oxygen and nitrogen species, stimulating things like mitochondrial catalase and reduced glutathione and superoxide dismutase, that kind of stuff, which are your cellular antioxidants. Herbal anti-inflammatories do this part way, meaning they might shut down COX-1, but they don't shut down COX-2. They mediate or moderate inflammation, but they don't totally suppress it, which is a much better way to go. But I'm finding that I need to use pretty high levels of these things. So what are we talking about? Depending on where the inflammation exists, if we are talking about neuroinflammation, then we are looking at a lot of our nootropic herbs. So we're looking at things like bacopa and ginkgo and white peony and blueberry and rosemary and lavender and St. John's wort and lemon balm, things like that. If we are talking about gut inflammation, then we are talking about, oh, and that last list could also include turmeric. If we're talking about gut inflammation, then we're talking about turmeric and plantain and chamomile and licorice and yarrow. And again, there's lists again for the kidneys, for the liver. And so, and let's not forget amla fruit and schizandra berry, which are astonishingly good, and rose hips, which are all wonderful herbs that reduce, that moderate or mediate the inflammatory process in a healing way. And so I am using very high doses of these things and getting pretty good results. And so getting back to the question, I think what you want to look at is look at the specific symptom picture the person has. It's not one tissue. It's probably, in most cases, 2, 4, 7, all. It's this whole process of systemic inflammation with associated HPA axis dysfunction. There's often sleep dysregulation, which goes hand in hand with the HPA axis dysfunction. The HPA axis is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is basically your master control of your endocrine system, much of your nervous system, immune function, reproductive function, the gut brain, the endocrine aspects of the heart, the endocrine aspects of the skin, endocrine aspects of the bone, and bone has endocrine aspects to it. And then again, dysregulation of the intestinal microbiome. And while probiotics can be of benefit here, I actually have found in most cases that probiotic foods work better. And bitters.